mind battle. Hello, I'm Carla Robinson. In late January, a government-appointed panel recommended that Canadian troops stay in Afghanistan instead of pulling out in 2009, but only if more NATO troops could be sent to help the Canadians in the dangerous southern part of the country. Casualties there have been heavy. More than 60 soldiers have been killed there in the last 2 years, and hundreds of others have been wounded. And then there are those like Corporal Travis Scouten, who, as the CBC's Susan Ormiston reports, came back from Afghanistan only to fight another kind of war.
A chopper is shot down. There are dead and injured. Canada's Quick Reaction Force moves in, but they're surrounded by Taliban insurgents. This could be Kandahar, but soldiers here call it Pretendahar. It's really Wainwright, Alberta. They're training battle-ready bodies, but how about minds? Some who train do not come back. 71 have died, 240 injured. But there are other wounds, harder to count. It's the mental cost of Mission Afghanistan.
I think the first big warning sign I had was that feeling of emptiness. That, whoa, like what was that all for? What did I accomplish over there?
Last Remembrance Day, Corporal Travis Scouten was battling the Taliban with 1st Battalion RCR. His tour ended in February. But from the moment the infantrymen touched down in Canada, he was a changed man.
I came back home and I'm just like, you know what, I just don't care. I just don't care about myself. I don't care about what we did over there. I don't feel like, I just felt ashamed of myself.
Ashamed?
Absolutely, I felt ashamed of myself.
Why?
I felt ashamed of myself because I really didn't know who I was anymore. You know, memories of Afghanistan, I was getting bad nightmares, and then on top of some of the stuff that goes on over there, then I'm starting to feel ashamed of myself for feeling this way. I'm like, hey, you know what, like, this kind of a man, like this isn't, what kind of a man am I?
Out there in violent Panjwai district, Charlie Company lost 6 soldiers. Travis lost a good friend. It was tough conditions and constant firefights. But coming back felt almost worse.
And then I came home on leave and you know, I started to get really bad nightmares and I started to get really heavy into booze. I just wanted to numb this world out and just live in my own little cocoon fantasy world.
Back there.
I just wanted to, in my head, to stay in Afghanistan.
The military is now tracking this war's psychological cost with a post-deployment screening, essentially a 12-page questionnaire asking about the soldiers' mental health. Out of 2,700 soldiers who've answered so far, here are the major concerns. 4.5% show signs of major depression. 5.2% show symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And 4.8% suggested other anxiety disorders.
They're somewhat different dimensions.
Dr. Mark Zamorsky is in charge of the screening program for the Department of National Defense.
What we're learning is around 15% of people have symptoms suggestive of one of 6 common mental health problems at the time of their screening. And many of those problems are at least in part related to the deployment.
So, for every unit rotating into Afghanistan, some will come back with a mental condition they didn't have before, including high-risk drinking, which showed up for 16% of returning soldiers. Only slightly better than half the soldiers returning from Kandahar have been screened at all.
I would suspect that we will see significant additional numbers of people coming forward. I mean, some of the people aren't back yet, even.
Oh, we missed one.
I missed one. Oh, did I? Oh, this is, you know, we make crosses wherever.
This is your buddy, Blake.
Yeah.
It didn't take long for Scouten to unravel. Only days back, drinking heavily, he took 4 passengers in his car and flipped it.
That was my huge thing to say, what's wrong with me? How could I have just gone over there and done something like that? How could these men that I've looked up to or that I've respected or that I loved make that sacrifice, and I come home and I'm such a loser that, you know, I'll put 4 people that are civilians in a car with me while I'm loaded, regardless of whether or not they knew. But I did that. And then, like, it was a really big slap in the face. What's wrong with me? You know? Why did I think that was okay?
You don't want any chili?
At home with his parents in Sarnia, Ontario, his mother, Anne LeClaire, was becoming deeply worried that the son she'd sent over had not come back.
Something had triggered him. He jumped up. He ran into the other washroom, and I could see him through the window pacing. And when I went by the door, and I opened the door very quietly because it's a pocket door, he wasn't there. He was talking to soldiers, and he was yelling at a commanding officer, and he was yelling that he couldn't get a clear hit. And then I started to say to him, drinking is going to make this worse, and I think you have PTSD. I think you're starting to show signs and symptoms that you're in trouble.
PTSD is a condition caused by severe trauma. Its symptoms, horrifying nightmares, re-experiencing traumatic events, detaching from loved ones, attempts to numb oneself with booze or drugs, and hypervigilance, which means you never think you're safe, even at home.
When I come home, that hypervigilance is crowds. Crowds are a big thing. I'm not comfortable because I just can't relax. I can't get my body, my mind to stop racing and looking and searching for something that could be a possible threat. It's ridiculous because I know that there's nothing going on, but I can't calm my body down.
In a soldiering culture, mind toughness is as critical as body. To admit frailty can be seen as a weak link in the chain. Throughout history, mental injuries have been the butt of cruel talk, labeled lame, lazy, or frauds. Many suffer quietly rather than face scorn.
You know, there's a stigma attached to it. You don't want to go forward and saying you're having a problem because it's not really looked upon as favorable. But there is still, and always will be, kind of an upbringing within the Canadian Forces, especially, I'm only going to speak from what I know, which is the infantry, that you don't feel that way. You go overseas, you do the job, you come to Canada, and you turn it off. It goes away. It doesn't mean anything. But there always will be a stigma attached to that. Let's be honest, you know?
A stigma from whom?
A stigma from your peers, a stigma from your superiors. I mean, whether or not somebody's going to come right out and say that to you, you still know that they're thinking that.
Anne LeClaire says she ran into resistance getting the right help from the military. Travis was on a cocktail of medications and still drinking. Her lowest point, the night he considered suicide.
We drove down to Petawawa, fully expecting to find my son dead. That night still haunts me. It just constantly haunts me. And it's hard for Travis to understand why I get a little overprotective. It's because I thought that I was afraid he wouldn't survive Afghanistan. I thought my fears would be over. And then suddenly I'm dealing with the worst nightmare of my life, and I'm in Canada.
The next morning, she confronted senior officers to come up with a care plan for her son.
We went on the base, and we took him to a commanding officer's office and said, I'm not leaving here. I need a strategy to help my son. And he looked at Travis and would not even look at myself or my husband and said, I was in Afghanistan too. Suck it up.
He said that?
Yes. And I'm watching this young man who is literally broken thinking, suck it up. My husband was the one who said, That's easier said than done. Look at him.
The Canadian Forces has been on a mission to change perceptions of mental injury, to persuade its members and chain of command that mental wounds are as serious as physical ones.
I pay very close attention to it as a commander. If I've got a spike in chronic cases of mental health issues, I want to know why. I don't right now. I've got what I would consider to be a manageable level based on extraordinary circumstances, and most of the soldiers are working through the issues reasonably well.
When soldiers leave Afghanistan, they spend 5 days decompressing in Cyprus.
Well, here we're going to take a look at...
Babe, I'm going to bed. Are you coming?
Just let me finish watching the rest of the show and I'll be there.
Part of that re-entry training is this American-made video, which shows what could happen back home.
I'm hit. We gotta get you to a medic.
Babe, are you okay? Jake?
They're warned to watch out for symptoms of mental stress in themselves and with their buddies.
I'm fine.
We have some very specific programs in place to try to reverse the stigma issue, but we're also trying to reverse many of the other sorts of barriers that people experience.
LeClaire is filling a book with detailed notes about stress injuries. On a crusade now, she's been impressed with some of the counselors within the forces. But at the top, she sees a kind of mental injuries chill.
One is, do not disrupt this mission at this critical time. I think that there's a huge fear that the public will actually know the numbers of soldiers that are actually suffering. I think that there's a huge fear that they will actually know that we don't have the funding, or what they feel is the lack of funding for the support for soldiers with OSIs and PTSD. I know that they're trying to make changes, and I'm happy about that, but the problem is I don't see the changes.
There have been changes. Since 2004, the military has been hiring psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, mental health nurses, social workers, addictions counselors. By 2009, the Canadian Forces will have nearly doubled its mental health operations at an additional cost of $98 million.
Pick up your weapon!
Long term, though, the military can't know the size of its future liability.
We do not yet have a complete sense of what the impact will be, in part because, as you pointed out, not everybody will come forward.
How do you plan to have mental health services for a population that you don't know what size it's going to be?
It's a challenge, and it's one that we're struggling with.
We need to put just as much money in to help these soldiers come back and to reintegrate into normal living.
With the dangerous combat mission in Afghanistan heading into a third year, the military needs a steady turnover of healthy soldiers. Many are being asked to do more than one rotation, and many will.
The reality is there are some people out there who are remarkably resilient, and some of those people are ready to hop back on the plane and go back a month after they came home. Other people are never ready to go back.
Travis Scouten wanted to stay a soldier. He still supports the troops.
I'm done.
Pray for you.
Thank you.
Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Sarnia.
And that's News in Review. I'm Carla Robinson. Thanks for watching.